Is the first major Starfield DLC, Shattered Space, worth buying and playing? The short version, for you internet goldfish out there, is if you didn't like Starfield, you're not going to like the Shattered Space DLC. There you go, I've saved you a lot of time, you can probably just go now. You're welcome. Although, on the off chance that I'm wrong about that, if there is somebody out there who did not like the original game, and yet, for some reason beyond any explanation I can come up with, you decided to try the DLC out and you liked it, I want to know your story. Please, just tell me why down below. So the quick version for people who did like Starfield is you will like the DLC. Yeah? Maybe? I'm afraid it's a little more complicated than that, and you don't get a short version, so my apologies. Before I go into details about the DLC itself, I should tell you that when I first started playing it, I got constant crashing. It was crashing every few minutes, but I did manage to fix that by clearing the files and pretty much making sure it was a fresh install of the game on Steam and updating my NVIDIA drivers. That last step was key. It really did make the DLC and the game a lot more stable, to the point where I only got 4 crashes for the rest of the playthrough. Which is not brilliant, but it's also not catastrophic. It's like 1 crash every 6 hours. It shouldn't happen, but it didn't really affect my opinion too much. Now, in spite of those early crashes, I actually got off to a good start with this DLC, and I really did like the atmosphere, the vibe that it was giving me. It reminded me very much of one of the main missions in the base game called Entangled. It had that sci-fi mystery horror thing. A lot of people said it reminded them of Prey, which is a superb game, by the way. You should play that if you've not played it. And I completely understand that comparison. There's definitely a similar vibe. Visually, it's pretty good. The design and the architecture are very cool and new. The planet that you end up on is kind of spectacular at times, actually. It's really quite alien, but it's got great sunsets and sunrises, and, you know, it really hits you quite hard initially and makes the place look fascinating and just a little creepy. I will say that, like a lot of other planets, it begins to feel a little barren compared to an Earth-type planet, you know, with lush trees and waterfalls, etc. But I guess that's to be expected. However, shortly after you arrive at the new planet, that strong horror vibe that I was getting sort of disappears as you get far more, well, ordinary types of quests whereby you have to help everyone fix their stuff. There's basically 3 houses. You need their help to save everyone, but they're not going to do it until you've helped them sort out their minor, realistically pretty damned insignificant issues compared to the real problem that's going on. At first, I was thinking, this really is not particularly realistic. It really isn't. These people should be focused on what is important. And then I remembered real life. But once you've gone through those various quests, you do get back to this weird sci-fi horror vibe. But actually, at this point, it's really lost its edge. For some reason, it just felt a little less horrific, a little less creepy, and I'm not saying the end of the quest was bad. It wasn't. It was fine, but the whole experience felt a little underwhelming compared to the sort of, well, the feeling I had right at the start when I first entered the space station and was sort of glancing around because I was hearing things and I really was expecting something horrible to happen at any time. So it does sort of lose a little bit of the vibe, I think. And of course there's a bunch of side quests, and if you've played Starfield or indeed any other Bethesda Game Studios game before, you know what to expect. They range from simple fetch quests and go all the way up to multi-part quests with various stages where you'll have to do a number of things to complete. I enjoyed most of them. The fetch quest got old quickly, but for the most part I did enjoy the side quests. What was a little different and somewhat notable about the quests in this DLC were the amount of dialogue they contained. Starfield actually has quite a lot of dialogue compared to Bethesda Game Studios' previous games, and this DLC seems to have leaned into it a lot. There's tons of dialogue actually. Most of it is really good, although occasionally I did find some of the delivery to be, a little stilted or a little off. Overall, I really appreciated that there were a ton of people I could speak to and get loads of info and lore about House Va'ruun. Oh, and I recommend that you take Andreja with you. She has got tons of dialogue. I mean, a lot to say. She will have something to add in pretty much every quest, often multiple times. Now, this might be true for the other companions. I haven't tried them yet. But if you don't know why you should take Andreja, make sure you've done her companion quest first. Honestly, it's definitely worth it. Although I have to say, she had a strange lack of any input at the end of the DLC. At the end of this, epic quest where I'm not going to spoil it, but, there is a situation that really I felt like she should have a lot to say about it. Nothing. Not a peep. Doesn't seem to matter how it ends. She just doesn't comment on it, which feels odd. Now, I have heard that some people are getting no dialogue whatsoever from Andreja, which does make me think there might be a bug out there. And I'm wondering if she did have dialogue at the end, but I just missed it. But I just thought I would mention that. That did seem to be an odd omission. So that's a brief overview of my experience playing the quests in Starfield. But what about other things like exploration? Well, I will say it was more fun exploring this planet than most other planets because it has been handcrafted and it is more interesting. But I have to say, it's still missing something. And it might be back to that lack of trees, the lack of greens, yellows, browns. It's very, very alien, and in spite of it being incredibly picturesque at times, it's not endearing. It's kind of like the Soul Cairn in Skyrim. For those of you that have done the Dawnguard DLC, you end up in a place called the Soul Cairn, and it's really interesting. It's definitely very weird and alien, and I enjoyed that part of that DLC, but after a couple of hours, you kind of get very tired of it. It's not the sort of place you'd want to stop and have a picnic or go fishing. So, although the planet was more interesting to explore, it wasn't that good. I was quite happy to get off the planet in the end. It didn't help that the new vehicle is a bit meh. I mean, I do not like the controls, to be honest, and the vehicle's more or less useless in combat, at least compared to my character on foot. And so whenever we got into trouble, I would just get out of the vehicle and fight, and then get back in the vehicle. And honestly, it's not even faster than using a boost pack travel, at least if you've got maxed skills for it. So once the novelty wore off, I just stopped using it and boost packed my way around the landscape. And it was so much faster and so much easier. So that's questing and exploring covered. What about new stuff? New items, new enemies, or new game mechanics? Well, there were quite a lot of new outfits, which was nice, and even one or two new pieces of armour, spacesuit type stuff, that were actually kind of cool to look at and had reasonably good stats. There were two new weapons that were interesting, although I couldn't really appreciate them because they were a type of weapon that my character wasn't that good at when compared to some others. And then there were a ton of reskinned weapons that were identical to the weapons in the base game. And honestly, that just felt a bit lazy, to be honest. There were some new grenades, although I didn't try them out because I never really got the urge. There were a couple of new enemies, although nothing to really talk about. They weren't that different, except for one new enemy type that has a new ability. And that ability will make fights a lot more challenging and a lot more interesting. It definitely got me a little more amped up when fighting because it added an element of unpredictability, and you really had to be, fast on your feet to deal with these types of enemies. I'm not going to spoil it for you. Most of you who've seen some clips can probably figure out what I'm talking about. So hopefully you now have an overview of what this DLC will offer you, and you might now be wondering, okay, but is it worth the asking price of $30 US? Well, before I answer that question, I do need to make you aware of one small problem that really is a major issue to me and maybe a major issue to you. And that issue is that you must join House Va'ruun. The main quest in this DLC is basically the House Va'ruun faction quest line, similar to the United Colonies quest line or the Freestar Rangers one, and you will need to join it to do that quest and more or less all of the side quests as well. Outside of the initial quest that puts you in contact with them, if you do not agree to join House Va'ruun, become promised, and adopt their religion, you cannot do more or less all of the content in this DLC. Now you might argue with me and say, yeah, but if you want to do the United Colonies questline, you have to join the United Colonies, same is true for Freestar Rangers, etc, etc. Why should it be different for this particular faction questline? And I might agree with you, had this questline been part of the base game, because then you would play a character and you would join which factions you thought matched that character, and then save the other factions for a different character. Or perhaps never. Maybe there's just a certain faction that you just would never want to do, maybe you never want to be a pirate, etc, etc. Now I'm not saying that this content should have been in the base game from the start. In fact, I tend to eye roll when I hear things like that. What I am saying is this content shouldn't be added through a DLC. At least certainly not the first ever DLC that is made for this game. It is very exclusive. And by that I mean it will exclude quite a few people from playing the character they were looking forward to playing in that DLC, assuming role-playing is something they care about. If you're not a role player, you're scratching your head and you just don't care about this. You're just going to agree to everything and that's fine. So that's not a problem. It's just for certain people who are playing a character, having an entire expansion pack where they buy it, plug it in, get right to the start and go, oh yeah, no, this character won't do that. Oh crap. Do I have to start a whole new character for this DLC? That's going to leave a sour taste in more than a few mouths, in my opinion. However, I managed to do the DLC without playing a true believer. I was just playing someone who didn't mind lying for the greater good. In fact, he'd argue he wasn't really lying because he never actually said that he believed. He just agreed to join. So, you can get around it with a little bit of semantics if you're playing a character that's okay with that. So with that out of the way, is this DLC worth $30? Ugh, that is a tough one. If we look at this numerically, if we look at the number of hours of enjoyment you can get out of this DLC, it took me about 25 hours to complete absolutely everything. I played reasonably fast because I had a high level character. Combat was relatively straightforward. I used a mixture of normal travel and fast travel, but my normal travel was super fast because, again, high level character, I could boost pack fly around the map very, very quickly. 25 hours, basically. That is similar to Dragonborn DLC, Dawnguard DLC, and even Far Harbor. And those DLC, well, the two Skyrim ones were $20 at the time, but if you adjust for inflation, that's about $27 today, and Far Harbor was $25 then, and that adjusts up to $33 today. So on paper, it's pretty much similar to those 3 DLC, similar amount of hours of enjoyment, and a similar price. But for some reason I have a hard time saying that it was worth $30. It reminds me a little of the Nuka World DLC, which was the same price as the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4, and had about the same number of hours worth of content. It's just, I much preferred the Far Harbor DLC, by far. The quests just grabbed me so much more. I enjoyed the exploration way more, and overall I came away from Nuka World feeling a little let down, whereas I came away from Far Harbor feeling really enthusiastic and really wanting to go back again in a new playthrough pretty quickly. I will say with Shattered Space, I've got no interest in going back for a long time, if ever, to be honest. I've done it, I enjoyed it, but yeah. More akin to Nuka World DLC. Is it worth it? You're not being robbed. You're not being robbed, but you're not getting a great deal. Of course, this is going to depend on what it is you want. What do you want to play? But to give you a comparison, do you remember that game that I mentioned earlier, Prey? The one that people were reminded of when they saw the footage of Shattered Space? Well, that game is absolutely brilliant. One of the most underrated games of that year, or ever, to be honest. It was my favourite game of 2017. It's also currently selling for $30 on Steam and GOG. So in the end, it's basically going to come down to what you want. If you really want to play more Starfield, this is definitely worth it. If you're looking for something new, something that changes Starfield, I'm not completely sure it's going to do that for you. So if you're looking for something new, you're probably better off spending your money elsewhere.